Your Majesties, Lords, ladies and gentlemen, great to have you all here at Cliveden, and great to have you here on this beautiful Sunday morning to discuss a dark subject, the court of Vladimir Putin. And I think there's never been a subject that is so current and of such fascination, in which so many people who know so little have declared that they know so much on so little basis. And so partly I'd like this session to be a tonic, a medicine for those of us who are exhausted with reading contemplations and guesses on the internet. And I've assembled what I think is a highly distinguished and stellar group of experts who really do know something about what's happening in the court of Putin. And so let me introduce you. Jonathan Haslam, professor at Princeton and Cambridge, author of Near and Distant Neighbors, expert on Russian war and American relations with Russia and the intelligence service, the intelligence organs that are so important in Russia today. So welcome. Mikhail Zyga, who is author of All the Kremlin's Men, was editor-in-chief of the Dozhd Rain liberal television station in Russia, and one of the people who really, I think that is by far and away, by the way, the best book on how Putin's Russia was made, how Putin rose to power, and who is who. Much better than any other book that I've read, and I've read all of them. And Mark Galeotti, who writes the Sunday Times. I loved his book, The Vori, on the mafia bosses and the mafia culture, but is now also an expert on power in the Kremlin, also the intelligence services. So, welcome. If I got everything there, Mark, I think I have. And his next book is going to be called Putin's Wars. So there you have it.
Out next month.
Out next month. And Misha's next book is out in the spring, and it's called War and Punishment. So a very Dostoevskian, Tolstoyan title.
We call it Tolstoyevsky.
Tolstoyevsky. So we have Tolstoyevsky here too. And Jonathan's next book is called Hubris, appropriately perhaps, about the American relationship with Russia. How America lost Russia, I guess, is a sort of short way. Anyway, let's begin. We've got so much to get through. Questions will be at the end. By the way, when we get to questions, just ask questions. If you wish to make a declaration, save that for another time. Just please ask a question, and these brilliant people, these brilliant luminaries will answer it. Otherwise, keep it to yourself. So let us begin. We're going to cover the Putin reign from the beginning. So I'm going to ask Misha first of all. We're going to jump around a bit, seemingly at random, but we will begin at the beginning and end at the end, whatever that end is. So, Misha, Putin's often described as a sort of accidental president. Obviously, no one accidental can successfully survive the bear pit of the Kremlin court for 22 years as supreme dictator. How did he come to power? How did it start? What talents did he show?
I'm not a conspiracy theorist, and every time when I have to choose between like some kind of evil strategy or stupidity, I always choose stupidity, and I think that I'm not wrong every time. Yeah. So there are several theories that there was a master plan from the beginning, and like KGB implanted Putin into Yeltsin's family, and I don't believe that actually. But there was a huge story behind that, and he was chosen by Yeltsin's family as the person to control KGB, to control FSB. And it's funny, it's incredible to remember right now that in the end of 90s, there were like two camps in Russian authorities. There was imperialist KGB post-Soviet camp headed by former Prime Minister Primakov and late Moscow Mayor Lushkov, and they were considered by the liberals, by the liberal majority, to be a threat, to be those people from the past who want Soviet empire back. and like oligarchs, and Yeltsin's family didn't want that to happen, and that's why they picked Putin to be the person to defend liberal values, to be the person to counter those KGB Soviet dinosaurs.
That project went well then.
Yes, yes. It's funny that in the beginning he made that impression. He like before being elected a president, he was the only Russian politician to propose that Russia could join NATO, but actually, the transformation was very swift, and definitely he was surrounded by. He had all those old imperial values. He had all that. He was surrounded by former KGB officers whose values were at the same time liberal and very imperialist. Actually, Yeltsin's family was liberal and imperialist at the same time, but it's really funny that they wrote the Russian Constitution of 1993 to make sure that the comeback to the Soviet Union is impossible. They designed it that way that the president has that superpower, and it cannot be controlled by the parliament, by the society, by no one, because they thought that okay, President Yeltsin is the safeguard of democracy and liberal values, and the parliament could be controlled by communists, by imperialists, and that's why we need to get rid of the parliament and to make the president super powerful. And then there comes Putin and uses all those leverages and all those instruments, but in the opposite direction.
And Jonathan, I mean, you study the intelligence organs. First of all, what do the Americans think of this project, the creation of Putin? And secondly, who did he bring with him, Putin? What he brought in a group of intelligence agents with him. How do you sort of rate him as a spy, if you like?
Yeah, I don't think he was very successful in KGB when he was in East Germany. He didn't get a frontline job. He had useful German, but he was not going to be a James Bond, and they knew that, and he must have known that too. But it meant that being in Germany, that's where the wall comes down. Leipzig is not a long way from Berlin, and his life had got better being in Germany, and all of a sudden it crashed. So he had a sudden sense of the total unpredictability of political life, and then returned and came back to Petersburg, what was then Leningrad, and tied up with Sobchak and became first deputy to the mayor, and ran the business deals with the help of the Germans, getting German money into Petersburg and getting his share of the deal. The Americans only knew about Putin through Yeltsin, and Yeltsin, as was said, was trying to safeguard his future, which was going down the tubes, because he'd refurbished the Kremlin courtesy of a Swiss company, of which his family and Yumashev took a whole chunk of money, and it was all going to come out. And Primakov and his people were, and although Primakov's very nice about Yeltsin in one of his many memoirs, they were going to deal Yeltsin a blow, and Putin was going to save Yeltsin, and that was the deal. So in fact, the Americans learnt about Putin at the summit, the last summit in November '99, Clinton and Yeltsin, and Yeltsin said, "Oh well, I've got this man Putin, and he he's pretty good as prime minister. He's great, straight down the line sort of guy, and by the way, he's going to win the next election." And Clinton said, he's going to win. Yeah, he's going to win the next election. It was all set, and so Berezovsky and all the oligarchs were going to be killed. The oligarchs were going to mash up Yeltsin. So Yeltsin just had too many enemies, and he wanted certainty. Putin seemed stable, seemed mentally stable, seemed disciplined, seemed
very predictable.
Yeah, a nice, predictable, patriotic young man who wouldn't do too much damage, because he didn't really have a record of damage. He had a record of corruption like everybody else, including Yeltsin.
So, Mark, just a couple of things that people need to understand before we move on is, first of all, just say a couple of words about the sort of cult of the Chekist in Russia. I mean, we've heard how Putin wasn't really much of a spy, but we also know that he was very proud of being a KGB officer. If you could just say a little word about the strange culture, the strange merging of secret police bureaucrat and sort of almost the world of the brigand in the secret police, which is such a big part of understanding Putin. And then we'll move on to how Russia has no succession, which I'll come to you in a second.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because we know from his actions, but also his own memoirs, turgid though they undoubtedly are, that Putin was, from a very early age, fascinated with the KGB. And in some ways, that's not surprising. There was this constant diet of wartime and later films about heroic Chekists, Chekak, coming from the very first Bolshevik secret police force, the Extraordinary Commission that was meant to be just a very temporary emergency measure to deal with the crisis of the Russian Civil War, which no one quite got round, as is always the way with these things, to abolishing. The original Cheka was a phenomenally brutal terror organization, really. And so it says something that became, again, the sort of the slang amongst themselves and so forth. So there was this cult, and at a time when Marxism-Leninism was very much on the wane, people were looking to other things in which to believe, and one was precisely the idea that there were these indomitable secret agents who were sort of capable of saving the nation from enemies without and within. And absolutely, Putin bought into that. When he was still at school, he went to the big house, the Bolshoi Dom, which is the headquarters of the KGB in what was then Leningrad. Now, this was the same building that had been the headquarters of the Stalinist secret police force. So, it's a place that is as steeped in blood as one could imagine. And on the whole, people would obviously seek to avoid it. And this school kid wanders in, and presumably to a very sort of bewildered an operational officer, says, "I'd like to join," and is essentially told, "Run along, sonny, go and do a degree first." And even then he says, "Well, what degree should I do?" "Law." And so, indeed, he decides. He commits himself. He's going to do law at Leningrad State University, which he does. So, he clearly has bought into this, even though, as we've heard, he was not a great spy. I mean, in East Germany, he was essentially handling reports back and forth, much less James Bond, as Jonathan said, much more Miss Moneypenny in that respect. But he clearly believes in it, and he still does. But that second point you made about the cult of the brigand, of the gangster, there is this extraordinarily violent and unpleasant, but still very powerful, cult of the so-called vori v zakonie, the thieves within the code. Who are these traditional gangsters? It's a culture that really built up within the Gulag labor camp system. And these are the guys that we know from film and telly. These are the ones with all the tattoos and all that kind of thing. And they have this very strong culture of no cooperation with the authorities or anything like that, which gets broken down under Stalin. And again, like the cult of the Chekists, becomes very mythological. This idea that these are the hard men whom no one can break. They will do anything, if they've promised to do something, then they'll die before let them down. Again, actually, thugs are thugs. But the point is, again, I think in this kind of ideological vacuum of late Soviet times, when no one can really believe, everyone has to parrot the nostrums of Marxism-Leninism. No one believes in it. You need to believe in something else. And these two different cults of the hard man kind of combined. And unfortunately, in Putin, they found their most loyal acolyte.
Well, he's famous for that comment during the first Chechen War. We'll whack them on the shithouse, which is very much a typical. Forgive me for my language, but that's a typical Putin comment, isn't it? Of the sort of slang, brigandish slang he uses.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. I mean, it's a little bit like sort of imagine David Cameron using Cockney rhyming slang. But the point is. in the context of Russia, he was signaling something. He was signaling by using sort of gangster language. He was actually signaling that I am the heir to this tradition. I'd like to add an impressive detail about his youth. And do you know who was Putin's favorite writer when he was a young man? It was a very famous Soviet writer named Julian Semyonov. He was like some kind of Russian John le Carré, Jan Fleming, political detective stories writer. And he created the character whose name was he was a Soviet spy, Maxim Isayev, who worked undercover in Third Reich as Stirlitz. And the best-known Soviet detective story, like a series named 17 Moments of Spring, that was favorite Putin's series. And in all interviews, he always said that he decided to go to KGB because he loved the series. And that's important that within the series of those books written by Julian Semyonov about Stirlitz, there is another novel that was a favorite novel of young Vladimir Putin, and that was a novel when Stirlitz, the main character, fights against Stepan Bandera and Ukrainian nationalists who have allied with Hitler, and that's the moment when young Vladimir Putin, for the first time, saw the name Bandera. And for the first time, he learned anything about Ukrainian nationalists allied with Nazis. And that's the source of his prejudice against Ukraine, against Ukrainian independence. And that's the source from where he knows the word Bandera. And he uses it now everywhere. Banderites is the synonym for Ukrainians in current Russian propaganda. It's really funny how his that youthful adornment of KGB and Soviet spies transformed into a hatred towards Ukraine.
Yeah, and when he gave his first interview, when he was still in the mayor's office, he arranged to have the Stirlitz theme music played during the interview, which is like which again, to use your meta, is like David Cameron having the James Bond music played for his first interview. So you get a picture. The one other thing I want to get clear, and maybe, Misha, you're the right one to explain this, is to explain the strange situation in Russia where there are elections, but there's no system of succession. And so that the dictator is both all-powerful, but also always insecure in a way. And could you explain how the strange sort of system, where there's no form of succession at all in Russia, there's no, which gives a great instability at the center.
Yeah, for decades there has been a long process of eradicating the political system, and actually we don't have any real political parties, and all those people who pretend to be politicians, they are not politicians, they are puppets. And it's not a coincidence that the same men are running for president every 4 or 6 years. And first they were running against Yeltsin, and now the same Putin, after 30 years, are running against Putin. They are not considered to be politicians at all. They are Mr. Zyuganov plays the role of communist forever. Unfortunately, Mr. Zhirinovsky has died. Sorry for the word.
Will that make any difference?
Unfortunately, but they are not considered to be real politicians. But at the same time, like being an independent journalist in Russia, I was asked frequently, is it really dangerous to be a journalist, to be an oppositional journalist in Russia? And I was always answering, yeah, actually not. Not as it's difficult, but not as, but it's as dangerous as being a plumber, because you can be captured by the police and tortured, and the probability of a plumber getting into trouble and a journalist is more or less the same. But it's not the same with the politicians. Anyone who tries to run for any elected office, even the school council, has to be approved by the system. And any independent candidate who was trying to run for any office within the last 2 decades got into trouble immediately. Like all the independent mayors of little cities were sent to prison, and that was a long period. So yes, there is no political system, there is no alternative, and it's such a hypocrisy that, for example, we had some kind of the revolution that didn't happen, the mass protests of 2011, 2012, when millions of people were marching every week in all Russia's big cities, and I had an illusion. I was running TV Rain that time, and our TV channel was the mouthpiece of all those protests, and we were covering all those protest rallies, and we had an illusion that we were prevailing, that actually he has to go, and like the whole country is against him, and the only question from propaganda that time was, who if not Putin? Because there was no alternative. And like actually the only alternative who turned up was Alexei Navalny, actually the only politician in Russia who's now in prison, but he could not be considered a successor for Putin's system, for Putin's mafia, for Putin's inner circle that could not allow Putin to go, even if he wanted to leave, like within the first presidential term till 2004, he could have thought of possible departure, and that was inappropriate for his inner circle, for KGB, for FSB generals who wanted him to be in power forever, because he is the only source of money, of legitimate, of everything. Like, and they are not going anywhere.
Let's talk about the mafia family. But Jonathan, you wanted to
Can I
comment
just roll back a bit? Because
yes, please
then
do.
We're left sort of wondering how this came to be. And I do think that in all these discussions about where we are and how we got here, the West plays an enormous role. When we get to Putin, we get 1999, 1998, 1999, then 2000, he gets elected. But you must remember the role the West played was towards centralization. They wanted one man to deal with who was responsible. So Yeltsin gets built up by Clinton, much criticized by...
First, they wanted Gorbachev and didn't want disintegration of Soviet Union.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Because, you know, the West likes big lumps to deal with. It doesn't like the fragmentation. The same with Yugoslavia. But the point is that the West, Clinton wanted to just deal with one man, Yeltsin, because the United States wanted to stay in Europe and expand NATO. And they had to fix it in some ways with Yeltsin. And then when Yeltsin starts to disappear from the scene, they have to fix it with the next man. The next man is Putin. So the baton is passed forward. And then people like Condi Rice, who said, you shouldn't focus on one man when Clinton was dealing with Yeltsin, proceeds to do the same thing with Putin as does Tony Blair. So British ambassadors were told, there's no problem in Russia. Tony is like this with Vladimir, no problem. So I'm afraid what happened in Russia is not unconnected with the way Russia was handled after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it continues.
We make the same mistake over and over again. Mark, just tell us, how does the court of Putin work now he is president? We've talked about the creation of Putin. Now let's move on to high Putin, before Ukraine, if you like. Is it like a mafia family? How does it work?
I mean, there is one aspect that is like a mafia family, and you touched on it in effect before, about the fact that there is no real retirement. You know, when there is no rule of law in reality. Yes, I mean, at a grassroots level, absolutely, a lot of things do get sorted by the courts and the police as they should be. But once you get to the sort of high politics, nothing really applies. So everything you are, everything you own, your personal security, the future of everyone around you, depends on your power. And if you're actually going to leave, you are essentially going to have to hand that to someone else whom you trust. And Putin is not a man who trusts easily, I think it's fair to say. So in that respect, it is, you know, we are in sort of Godfather 3 territory. But more broadly, look, Putin is absolutely the autocrat. He is in many ways quite a lazy autocrat. We have this image that he is the sort of the grand mastermind of everything. He's not. He's very happy just simply to be the decider. So the people around him compete to pitch ideas. It's sort of the dragon's den approach to running a country. They pitch ideas, or they do things that they think that Putin will approve of, in the hope of then him saying, yes, I like that, yes, go for it, because obviously if you do think the right things, you get rewarded.
And normally he approves everything. Even if they contradict each other, he says yes and yes.
Exactly, because we'll see which one goes.
And watches them running.
Yeah, and then the ones that work, he rewards, and the ones that don't, it's, well, it's nothing to do with me, mate. You know, so this is very much his approach, and because, again, the real currency of Russia is not the ruble, nor indeed the dollar. It is political access to the boss. If you have his favor, then government contracts will come your way, or whatever else. So I think this is the really way it works. You know, you call it a court, and it is precisely that. It is, I mean, I've also called it an adhocracy, in that, you know, your actual job isn't really what's on your business card or your door sort of plate. It's what the boss wants you to do today. So we have a situation now where basically, you know, Syria was being run by the Defense Ministry. Policy towards the Balkans was being run by the Secretary of the Security Council. Venezuela is essentially considered to be the preserve of Rosneft, the oil company. You know, I mean, so basically it's, you know, whatever the boss wants, you compete to provide it, and he will reward you if you're successful, and not usually punish, but just simply disavow you if you fail. And that works so long as there's lots of resources and people are coming up with good ideas. But on the other hand, it is also a deeply problematic one in, I know I'm kind of pushing the timeline forward, but situations like now, when the boss is basically rather distracted, he's, you know, occupied by one thing, his authority is clearly damaged, because he's built a system which is deliberately unstable. Everyone is competing against everything else. And he relied on being the one who could actually resolve these disputes, but he's not doing it now.
Well, let's jump ahead to the war now, because that's where we're all fascinated by. So Misha, in the war at the moment, we're watching. We get clues from internet leaks, supposed American intelligence with supposed access to meetings. We know very little what's happening really in the room with Putin, but we hear the defense minister Shoigu is down. We hear there's a new general. We hear about Kadyrov, the Chechen viceroy, kind of mini autocrat. We hear of Prigozhin, the Wagner mercenary billionaire, Putin's chef. These are all fascinating characters who all seem to be doing exactly what Mark's talking about. It's like running their own policies, running their own units. Could you give us a picture of the court at the moment?
Yes, definitely, because it's all true. It's all true what you've said, but one very important person is missing. The key person is missing from this picture, and a very important period needs to be addressed when we're talking about the war, and that's the COVID quarantine. 2020 changed the way how he communicates the same way as he used to be, but he became really self-isolated. He spent summer of 2020 not alone, but almost isolated in his residence, together with his best friend Yuri Kovalchuk, who is really like there is famous phrase Putin's Rasputin, and there are a lot of versions. Who is Putin's Rasputin? So if I would choose, that's Yuri Kovalchuk, who is really the closest friend of him. It's not easy to say who influences whom. They are alike. Kovalchuk doesn't have any official position. He's not a politician. He owns all Russian media. He is the media mogul, but he really owns everything. You cannot imagine that. Like every single TV channel that is not state-owned is Kovalchuk's.
Where did he come from? Who described Kovalchuk as a person?
He comes from St. Petersburg. He was old friend of Putin when he worked for the mayor's office in St. Petersburg. He was a member of that famous dacha company, Lake, together with Putin and several other guys. They co-owned a territory and built dachas there.
Yeah.
So he is a son, and it's also very important, and I have a lot about it in my future book, War and Punishment. And he is the son of a well-known Russian academician, a historian. And you guess what was the speciality of Kovalchuk the senior? He was historian of Sebastopol, of the Russian, the port of Russian glory, of Russian Crimea. So he's very close to that topic. And actually, for many years before the annexation of Crimea, that was not the hot topic in Russian society. Russian society was not waiting for Crimea to be back home, as they call it, but probably for Kovalchuk's family, that was important. So Kovalchuk stayed with Putin and became the closest person to him within the last 2 years. That became really, we know a lot of speculations about Putin's health, about that supposedly he was operated for cancer years ago, and probably because of that he became too cautious about meeting people. Everyone, including almighty Igor Sechin, the head of Rosneft, had to wait for 2 weeks to get an access. And actually he was sitting under quarantine every month for 2 weeks, and that made the system of taking any decision bizarre, because half of most important bureaucrats in Moscow were sitting under house arrest like half of their time, because they wanted to and proximity to power is very important, really. So they cannot just let Kovalchuk or Anton Vaino, the head of presidential office, to be the doorkeepers.
Yeah.
And so his mindset has changed within all those years. His paranoia became bigger, obviously. Russian politics is controlled by Kovalchuk to some extent, because there is a man in charge whose name is Sergei Kiriyenko. He used to be a very famous liberal prime minister under President Yeltsin back in 1998. And he was called Kinder Surprise that time, because he was really young when he was appointed. Now he was appointed back to Kremlin a few years ago, and he is Kovalchuk's man. He is like he runs the domestic policy, and he is in charge of Donbass. He is in charge of all those territories. He is viceroy of Ukraine now, and actually he is appointed by Kovalchuk. So Kovalchuk is the man who runs all those territories.
I just want to come in and ask about the intelligence services now. Mark, I want to ask both of you, because the intelligence services are obviously key. There are all these telegram sort of conversations, supposedly by, Chekists talking about Putin and grumbling. Are they real? Are the intelligence services, where are they? Does he still trust them? Who's up, who's down in the intelligence services? Are they ever going to launch a coup against him? What do you think?
I mean, the whole coup scenario is one of our sort of wishful thinking Deus ex machina. Look, I think the intelligence services are just like the rest of the Russian officialdom. They are not staffed by Putinists. They are staffed by ruthless, pragmatic, opportunist kleptocrats. who are constantly making cost-benefit analyses of the risk of doing anything against Putin against the risk of doing nothing. And at the moment, the risk of doing anything against Putin massively outweighs the risks in just keeping your head down and hoping things work out. Now, I mean, in that context, as we saw with 1989 and the collapse of the Warsaw Pact states, you know, regimes can look incredibly tough, incredibly in charge, until all of a sudden they don't. Because once you start getting defections, no one wants to be left behind. No one wants to be the last person to jump ship. But I mean, in this context, I think, look, for the people within the intelligence community, yes, there's a constant jockeying for power. The FSB is still the preeminent one. It's Putin's old service. But on the other hand, he is aware enough to make sure that it does not completely devour the others. He needs to have that divide and rule. But essentially, these are people who I think regarded as highly unlikely that they will be in as privileged a position in any kind of post-Putin era as they are at the moment. And I think that's one of the things that makes the prospects of any kind of coup, unless something disastrous happens down the line, inordinately unlikely.
You're an expert on the foreign intelligence services of both the GRU and the FSB. What do you think they're capable of?
Yeah, I have no idea. What I've noticed is how few defections we have. The recent ones are FSB and which is the domestic or covering former Soviet Union as well, and they messed up badly in Ukraine, and they gave misinformation that Ukrainians were waiting for the Russians with flowers, and a number of these people have been put in the brink for their services. The SVR under Naryshkin was at KGB school with at the same time as Putin, but like most people who were there when he was there, they didn't know him at all. He was insignificant. And Naryshkin was terrified. When they moved on Ukraine, he knew from his reporting from abroad that this would be a total disaster, as did Lavrov. So they weren't included in on the decision. So these people have been cut out, but they're competing. Military intelligence versus FSB versus SVR. And so there's no way they all sort of get together and gel, and as Mark has said, there's no way they can cohere. And my view is that any change has to come from the street. It doesn't, and it comes from the mothers of the soldiers and people like that. It doesn't come from the top. But what the worry for the Kremlin, if you've been to Russia, and Mikhail can tell everybody, I mean, when you go there, Red Square fills up, or those streets nearby fill up. Those are the masses. When those masses start to form, it doesn't matter if you've got a kosh or whatever. If it's full of old women and people who just won't give way, then the regime is towards its end. We didn't see that with Gorbachev because it was a revolution from above. But we have yet to see a revolution from below in Russia, and we may yet see one. I don't see it coming from above.
Well, there have been very few successful revolutions from the people. Even Nicholas II was actually forced to abdicate by the generals when he was stuck in his, poor thing, was stuck in his railway station, in his train. But Misha, come to you. I mean, what I wanted to go back to is the Ukraine invasion. If Putin had invaded in 2014, do you rather than just taking Crimea, do you think he'd have got away with it all?
Definitely, if he would have been much more successful. Yeah. Because it's obvious, everyone admits that Ukraine was not ready, and Ukrainian army barely existed. Yeah. So if Russian army started the war in March, April 2014, they could have take over the whole country.
React. What do you think of that, Jonathan? Just going to run through all of you. Did Putin make a massive mistake?
When the little green men appeared in Crimea, and Putin very cleverly said, nothing to do with us. And I thought, oh, I know, SBS or British Special Forces combined with the Americans go in and take them out. There weren't so many, put them in helicopters and drop them off in the Libyan desert. Well, they've been disowned. They weren't wearing proper uniforms, but they didn't. They hesitated, and the very people who are advising and running things for Biden couldn't get Obama to do anything. So the door was wide open.
Right.
And then the sanctions that were delivered, we always get told we've got new sanctions against Russia, and I'm thinking, I'm sorry, I thought we'd been doing this since 2014. But the point was the door was ajar for NATO, and he could have done what he liked. And in fact, I think the plan that they used was the plan they were originally going to use in 2014. For some reason, Putin hesitated, maybe on advice from Naryshkin and others, and this time he didn't take that advice. But my view is the ground plan was there in 2014.
Yeah, when I argue in the world
I think that's important that he didn't want to take Ukraine in 2014 because he didn't have an ambition to conquer Ukraine because he needs to control Russia. Ukraine is a tool to stay in power. His master plan is not to conquer more soil. He wanted that time to be sure that he is untouchable and he is safe in power. And Crimea was enough, actually. He didn't want to start the war in Donbass. Crimea was enough to start the patriotic hysteria and to make a lot of people love him. And he needed the new wave of that patriotic
Mark, do you agree with
hysteria.
that?
Yeah, I think there's always a danger in assuming that there's this sort of long, grand plan. I think, exactly, Putin in 2022 is different from Putin in 2014. In 2014, I mean, I remember talking to someone from the Russian Foreign Ministry, because I was living in Moscow at the time of all this in 2014, who was convinced. He said, look, we know. And bear in mind, I'm just simply reporting, I'm not endorsing this view. He said, look, we know the Ukrainians are going to screw everything up, and they'll be back. There was this idea that the Ukrainians were going to mess up their attempt at their new revolution,
That's
and
a Hamilton
they would need
musical,
Russia.
yeah? You understand? That's a Hamilton musical.
The Hamilton musical.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. Which I mean, we all understand is actually a thinly veiled satire of Putinism. No, I mean, but in 2022, exactly, he'd had his year with Kovalchuk being sort of, muttering over Ukrainian perfidy. But also, he was older, and I think this was a triumph. The idea was the quick conquest of Ukraine was going to be the triumph that finally puts him in the ranks of Russian state-building heroes. That's his place in history would then have been ensured. In 2022, he's closer to thinking about that than he is in 2014.
But I'm going to ask you questions in a second, but let me just finish up by asking all three of you, how does this end? How does ours fall? How do they die? Impossible question, but I'm asking all three of you just to answer that, and then we're going to get to questions, starting with you.
Well, I mean, czars tend to die, but the point is they have succession. They have a clear notion of who's meant to take over, and yes, there can be all kinds of shenanigans around it. So, I mean, I think how this ends is probably it does end with Putin dying. The Ukraine war can be ended before then, but this system needs Putin to die before it moves on.
That's a good place to stop.
Yeah.
Misha,
100%.
quick answer.
100%. He doesn't have the way out being alive because he has seen the video of Muammar Gaddafi's death on YouTube. So he knows that if he resigns in a second, he will be killed as Muammar Gaddafi. That's why he doesn't going. He's not going to leave. He stays till he's dead.
Okay.
Well, I think he may have a one-way ticket to Saudi Arabia like Idi Amin, and relations are very good, and if he's there, he's safe. Probably the only place
But in
he's safe.
Sheremetyevo, he's going to be.
Yeah, but there
might
are
not get
private
out.
planes. But I think the other point, my view, when we mentioned about the Tsar, we're very different. Russia is not the same as it was in those days. 85% peasant illiteracy and the rest of it. In my view, the street is important in Russia. And although at the moment where you go out there and they'll grab your mobile phone and cosh you and drag you off, if the elderly get on the street because of the deaths of unwilling conscripts in Ukraine. In the end, the pressure may build. And when you listen to Volodin, the Duma, and he's going on about that, he's cut short, Putin has been forced to cut short the length of conscription, so they've only got 2.5 weeks to go. He reckons he's got 255,000 people, including all these, the lame and the dumb from all sorts of camps and prisons, and somehow he's made up the difference. He's backing off on conscription because it is incentivizing people out onto the street. I think he fears the street.
Okay,
unfortunately, I don't believe.
You don't believe that?
I don't believe
very
in
quickly, because we're going
public
to
uprising.
Now.
It took, like, for the first time in Soviet Union during the war with Afghanistan, for the first time people started criticizing the war only after Perestroika started, and it was allowed to talk about that in the press. And there were no criticism, no public uprising, anything. And there is no, even after the mobilization, there were not a single real rally against
Okay, so for you it's court conspiracy is the only way out, and death. Right, on that note, let's have lots of questions. Fascinating. We've got to be very quick. Everyone ask their questions quickly. I will enforce quick answers. Where do we start with? Why don't we start right here with this lady here?
Yes, if he knows, if Putin knows he's going no way out except to die, is he going to push the nuclear button on his way out?
Okay.
No.
No.
That's very short.
No. We've got to have short answers. We're going to have a lot of questions, complicated questions.
No, because he has children.
Okay,
if he
next.
were a bachelor, I'd worry.
This gentleman here now, please.
Hi there. We all knew that Putin is bloodthirsty, but this was great insight. However, looking at the current crisis in Ukraine, which for me it looks like a lose-lose situation, and the fact that Putin had warned the West what he would do, and he's actually done it, do you think with hindsight the West could have played its cards differently?
That's for you, very much.
Yeah, well, it could have played its cards differently from the start in the early 90s. I just think NATO expansion and putting Ukraine on the list, it was on the original list in 1993 in the White House, Ukraine and Georgia. Georgia, it wouldn't have mattered, but Ukraine, that was a killer, and Yeltsin fought it, what was coming, and said, well, you know, delay, don't rush this. But the point is that Ukraine is the back door into Russia. I mean, Russia without Ukraine, what is this? And particularly when democracy...
It's a normal country.
Yeah, when democracy started taking off with Western aid from 2003 and trying to get rid of these stooges that were being put in charge, then, you know, then Putin starts moving on it. So what we do and what we have done, or our governments have done, has played into this. It's still playing into this. Why hasn't the foreign ministry lost all its personnel? Where are these defecting Russian ambassadors? There's been one defection in Switzerland from some junior character in an international organization. Why are the others waiting? What are they waiting for? You know, there are a lot of questions that don't relate just to Putin, that relate to Russia and its identity and how it was treated in the 90s. It was treated in abominable fashion. There was no Marshall Plan for Russia. There was money for old rope for some people. There was corruption. We fed the corruption, but we didn't feed the political change. So this is a co-responsibility.
I'm sorry, I'm going to keep going fast because there's so many people. This person here, yeah, this gentleman here.
So if Putin goes, does the Hydra grow another head, or do we see something different?
That's for you.
I am unfashionably optimistic, actually, about... Look, if you look at the 50-somethings and the early 60-somethings who are sitting there looking at their watches thinking, when are the gerontocrats? Because remember, Putin is 70, his close circle, they're all 68 plus. These people are, again, they are amoral kleptocrats. That's fine. We know how to deal with kleptocrats. We do it all the time. And from their point of view, they want to go back to the good old days when you could steal at home, bank and spend abroad. War is bad for that.
Okay, yes, this young lady here.
Hi. You mentioned a kind of Rasputin type figure in Putin's life, and I was wondering what role religion or Russian Orthodoxy, if it was to play a part in this, what part it would play?
It's much more of cynicism, and like I guess they're trying to use Orthodox Church as the ideology ministry. It's not working. It's one of the most hated institutions, state corporations in Russia, because like it's really corrupted, the symbol of corruption. I guess it's much more cynical approach, and I guess the younger generation of Putin's crooks is also very cynical. It's not going to be much better than his generation, and I guess that the same mistakes as described by Jonathan could be made when dealing with all those people without any values. They do not believe in God. They do not believe in anything.
Okay, I think it was a lady down. Yes, this lady here, putting her hand up with the white jersey. And then we're going to come to more of you. Okay.
First of all, I found listening to you gentlemen extremely interesting and enlightening. But my question is, I recently had the opportunity of seeing the play The Patriots, which featured the Russian oligarch Berezovsky, who in the play was instrumental in putting Putin into power. My question is, how true is that?
That's for you.
That's true, yeah. That was an operation organized by Yeltsin's family and Berezovsky. It's well known. Berezovsky was the first victim of Putin's rule. Putin never considered himself to be a puppet in Berezovsky's hand. But by the way, Yeltsin's family is still in Moscow. They pretend that they are very liberal and silently denouncing what he's doing, but they are in Moscow and they are fine.
And I remember Berezovsky telling me at the height of his power that he said, like, you've got to understand the way we work here. This is like a Renaissance city under the Medici, is what he said. Yeah. And so that was an interesting conversation. And then we're going to come to you.
I'm sorry. That's important to mention that as well. For example, Berezovsky was the most important sponsor of the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. So he was a serial kingmaker.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've said Putin's regime ends in his death. Is that going to be through natural causes or assisted suicide?
Given the abysmal performance of the Russian army in Ukraine, what's the significance of this killing yesterday of this the shooting of the 11 recruits in the recruitment center? What does this signify as far as the effort of recruiting newcomers into the army? Or are you not aware of what happened yesterday?
Yeah.
Why don't we start with Mark with that?
I mean, very briefly on that, this is what happens when you basically force people into fighting a war they don't really want to fight and don't know how to fight. And unfortunately, there are probably going to be more such incidents. But very, very briefly, abysmal performance of the Russian military. We have to acknowledge the degree to which Ukraine had a secret weapon, which was Vladimir Putin. I mean, the Russian military has a way it trains, equips, and prepares to fight. And that's not how they were deployed. And in many ways, I mean, it's a sort of fitting irony that Putin himself ensured that his Russian military would perform vastly worse than it might have under other circumstances.
I'm sorry, I'll try to be short and very cynical. Actually, Putin knows that he cannot win in Ukraine. The only war he can win is the war against his own people. And like his real war is against Russian people because he wants to control Russian people. So this war and like mobilization is the method to control and to terrorize the population of Russia. In that sense, Russian army is his biggest enemy because he's afraid of anyone who could be potentially capable to challenge him. And like there are no contenders within his inner circle, and you can notice that the Russian army is faceless and nameless. We know almost there are no heroes in Russian army. There are no generals who are in command because like he cannot afford them to become famous generals and then possibly to challenge him. And the only generals we know are those who are cursed by Ramzan Kadyrov and Prigozhin.
Yeah. Okay, I think we've got time for a few more. So somebody at the back who's standing up there, that gentleman. Oh, okay, we'll have this person first. Ask your question, and then okay, and then we'll go to the gentleman at the back, and then we'll answer both of them together.
Okay, this is a question, I guess, about succession in a sense. But if, as the professor said, Ukraine is the backdoor to Russia, and millions of Russians still believe that Crimea, at least, and maybe Donbass should belong to Russia, is there not a likelihood that in the future there will still be, I mean, whoever the leader of Russia is, they will still want to keep hold of Crimea and eastern Ukraine?
It's a good question. And just the gentleman at the very back, that's the last question, and then we're going to finish up here with all of you saying something.
Where does Roman Abramovich stand in all this? Does he have a role in sorting something out, like has been rumored?
Thank you. Okay, listen, this has been a brilliant... I'm just going to finish up with a word from every one of them about what's happening next. That's a very good question about Abramovich. Thank you, Jonathan Foreman, about the Crimea. Just to say, all of our books are available, and we're all going to be signing afterwards. So see you in the bookshop, I hope. These three have brilliant books out, and their new books will also be brilliant. I'm very pleased to have you all today. Thank you very much. Right, let's just finish up with one basic question, which sort of answers all of these. How will the war be won? How will it be lost? Negotiated settlement, ramp off, nuclear war? I want you all to answer this massive question in a very short way, starting with you. How does it end?
Okay, and I'm going to pick up the point about Crimea, that was first raised, the fuss, by Rutskoy, right, when he was vice president under Yeltsin after the end of the Soviet Union. So that's something historical, that's something that remains with a lot of Russians in their minds. It should be Crimea. How does it end? I think there's a means of ending by negotiation. Guterres at the UN tried it with Putin back in March. I thought there was a deal to be had. And the Turks, I think Turkey is going to push mediation further. And as was said, if Putin's latest statements seem to suggest he's lost this ambition for Ukraine. If you read yesterday's statements, he sort of started to talk about Crimea and even stopped talking about Donetsk. So I think there's room for negotiation. And this war is not just run from Ukraine, it's run from the Pentagon. All the intelligence, most of the important weaponry, how to use it, everything comes from the Pentagon. So that deal has to be struck through the United States or it's valueless. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. That's the big picture. Misha, very quickly, we're really out of time. I want just both of you, just one sentence, please.
I'm afraid, or I don't know if I should, I think that Russia is going to be disintegrated and will lose not only Crimea and but also Chechnya and probably some other regions. And I guess the problem is that for many Russians, they are at war not with Ukraine and not for Crimea, but with the West. And they think that Russia was attacked by the West and they're fighting against America. And that's the infection, the imperialist, anti-Western infection that is not going to be healed quickly.
Okay,
that's the problem.
I've got to stop you there. Last sentence, very quickly.
Okay.
Hard one to give to you, but
look, I think ultimately, Ukraine will take back its territory, possibly with the exception of Crimea. But what I would say is the weak link is us. Ukraine depends not just on military supplies, but constant flows of economic assistance to keep its economy on life support. And if Putin has any thoughts of avoiding a defeat, it is not because the Ukrainians give up, it's because we do.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Thank you.